"Uncle, please stop. Let me go. I promise not to tell anyone." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her desperation filled the small room like smoke from a fire. She struggled, pushing against his firm grip, her heart racing as fast as her thoughts. But Uncle Chitty only chuckled darkly. His breath was thick with the smell of palm wine, his heavy hands pressing her down as he whispered, "You know the rules, Nkem. You tell no one. No one will believe you." She squeezed her eyes shut, biting her lip to stop the sob from escaping. Would this ever end? She had asked herself that question every night for the past year, ever since her mother died and she was sent to live with Uncle Chitty and his wife. In public, he was the perfect guardian, kind, responsible, respected. But in the darkness of his home, he became someone else, someone monstrous. Nkem had tried to tell Auntie Ifioma once. She had cried, begged her to listen. But her aunt had only frowned and scolded her. "You should be grateful. Your uncle is taking care of you." That was the moment Nkem knew. No one would save her. No one. Except herself. And so, she waited, watched, listened, planned. Then one night, everything changed. Uncle Chitty had been careless. He had forgotten to lock the door. And this time, Nkem was ready. She knew his routine. Knew that after drinking himself into a stupor, he would fall asleep deeply, leaving his keys in his pocket. Her hands trembled as she reached for them, slowly pulling them out. One wrong move and it would all be over. Her heart pounded. The air felt too thick to breathe. Click. The door creaked open. She didn't wait. She ran. But what she didn't know was that something else was waiting for her outside that door. Something she never expected. And in that moment, Uncle Chitty wasn't the one she had to fear the most. Nkem sprinted down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold tiles. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heartbeat a thunderous drum in her ears. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. If she did, she might freeze. The compound gate was just a few meters away. Just a few more steps and she would be free. But then, a shadow moved in the darkness. She skidded to a halt, nearly crashing into the figure standing before her. "Where do you think you're going?" Her stomach twisted into a knot. Auntie Ifioma. The woman's face was unreadable under the flickering security light. Her wrapper was loosely tied, her hands crossed over her chest. Her eyes, sharp as a blade, bore into Nkem's trembling form. For a moment the world stood still. "Speak up, Nkem." Her aunt's voice was eerily calm. "What are you running from?" Her throat felt dry. The words wouldn't come. Would Auntie Ifioma help her? Or send her back? Uncle Chitty," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. A door banged open behind her. She turned. Uncle Chitty was awake. His face was twisted with rage, his drunken haze evaporating as he locked eyes with her. "You ungrateful child," he roared, stumbling forward. "Where do you think you're going? You dare run from me?" Kem's body shook violently. This was it. He was going to drag her back inside. Make sure she never tried this again. She took a step back, then another, her mind screaming for her to run. But Auntie Ifioma's grip tightened around her wrist. "You wanted to say something about my husband?" her aunt asked, her tone disturbingly neutral. Nkem's chest rose and fell, her entire body trembling. Was she about to betray the man of the house? Was she about to expose the truth? She opened her mouth, and Auntie Ifioma slapped her. The sound rang through the compound, echoing like a gunshot in the silence of the night. Nkem staggered, her cheek burning, her heart shattering. "How dare you?" her aunt hissed, her voice dripping with disgust. "After all he's done for you, you dare try to shame him?" Tears welled in Nkem's eyes. She wanted to scream, to fight, to make her believe. But she knew the truth now. Auntie Ifioma had always known. She just didn't care. A slow, sickening smile spread across Uncle Chitty's face as he reached for her. He had won. Nkem's vision blurred. No, not this time. She wouldn't go back. She wouldn't let them silence her again. And so, in one desperate, reckless move, she ran straight out of the compound and into the night. not knowing where she was going, not knowing who would help her, but knowing she would rather die than ever return. Kem ran. She didn't know where her feet were carrying her. But she did not stop. The night air was thick with the smell of damp earth, her nightgown flapping against her trembling legs. Her lungs burned. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs like a war drum. But still, she ran. Behind her, she heard shouting. Uncle Chitty's voice. "Come back here, you useless girl. You have nowhere to go." Her legs screamed in protest, but she pushed forward, weaving through the narrow streets of the town. The houses stood silent, their windows dark. Nobody would come out to help her. Her bare feet hit the main road, and for a terrifying moment, she felt exposed. A lone figure in the dead of the night. Then, a pair of headlights flashed in the distance. A car. Kem's heart leaped into her throat. She had seconds to decide. Stay in the open and risk being caught, or take her chances with whoever was driving. The vehicle slowed as it neared her. She hesitated. Then, Uncle Chitty's voice roared from behind. She turned her head. He was running toward her. Kem didn't think. She lunged forward, waving frantically. "Please, help me, please." The car screeched to a stop. The driver's side door flew open. A man stepped out. Kem froze. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a crisp shirt. But it was his face that made her breath hitch. The man was a police officer. Her lips parted in disbelief. Had she just been saved? Uncle Chitty slowed down when he saw the officer, his expression twisting into something unreadable. He was panting, sweat dripping down his face, but still he smiled. "Oh, officer," Uncle Chitty called out, walking closer. "Thank God you're here. My niece ran out of the house in the middle of the night. She's a troubled girl, but I love her like my own child." Kem's stomach twisted. "Lies, lies, lies." The officer turned his sharp gaze to her. "Is that true?" She shook her head so hard it hurt. "No." Her voice broke. The words refused to come out. Her uncle chuckled. "You see what I mean? Poor child is confused. She needs help." For a moment, the world felt like it was slipping away from her. Would this officer believe her? Or would he hand her back to the devil? Then, just as she thought she had lost, something happened. From the back seat of the car, a woman stepped out. Kem turned and her blood ran cold. She knew this woman. It was Auntie Kemi, her mother's childhood best friend. The woman who had once sworn to protect her. And she was staring at Nkem like she had just seen a ghost. "Nkem?" Auntie Kemi's voice trembled. "My God. What are you doing here?" Kem's knees buckled. This was it. This was her chance. She looked up at the woman she barely remembered but had once trusted. Tears spilled down her face. "Auntie Kemi," she whispered, her voice broken. "Please, save me." For a moment, time stood still. The only sounds were Nkem's ragged breathing and the distant chirping of crickets. Auntie Kemi's face was frozen in shock, her eyes scanning Nkem's trembling form. The thin nightgown, the dirt-streaked legs, the raw terror in her eyes. Then something changed. Her expression hardened. She turned to Uncle Chitty, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Chitty, what is she talking about?" Uncle Chitty's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but then he let out a deep chuckle. "Ah, Kemi, my dear sister. This girl is disturbed. She ran out of the house in the middle of the night, shouting nonsense. She's just looking for attention." Kem's hands curled into fists. "Lies, more lies." The police officer glanced between them, his face unreadable. "Sir, you said she's your niece?" "Yes," Uncle Chitty said smoothly. "She lost her mother and I took her in. I've done everything for her." He shook his head, sighing heavily. "And this is how she repays me." Auntie Kemi's eyes narrowed. "That's funny," she said coldly, "because I remember Nkem's mother telling me she had a sister in the village who was supposed to take care of her. Not you." Silence. Uncle Chitty flinched. Nkem's breath caught. She saw it. That small, fleeting moment of panic in his eyes. Auntie Kemi stepped closer. "Why didn't she go to her mother's sister?" "Chitty?" Uncle Chitty let out a forced laugh. "Ah, Kemi, is that why you're looking at me like that?" You know how things are. The woman couldn't afford to take care of Nkem. I took responsibility. Auntie Kemi scoffed. You took responsibility? She gestured at Nkem, who was standing there like a frightened deer. Then why does she look like someone who just saw a ghost? Nkem swallowed hard, her pulse racing. This was it. Her chance. If she didn't speak now, she might never get another opportunity. She took a shaky breath. Auntie Kemi, her voice was hoarse, broken. He hurts me. A pin could have dropped in that moment. Uncle Chitty's face darkened. Nkem. Auntie Kemi raised a hand, silencing him. What do you mean, Nkem? She asked softly. Kem's throat tightened. The words felt like knives, but she forced them out. Every night, Auntie Kemi stiffened. The police officer's eyes narrowed, and Uncle Chitty's mask finally cracked. His hands clenched, his breathing turned erratic. He knew his time was running out. You foolish girl, he suddenly bellowed, stepping forward. You want to bring shame to me? I took care of you, fed you, gave you shelter. Nkem flinched, but Auntie Kemi moved first. She stepped in front of Nkem, blocking her from Uncle Chitty's reach. Then she turned to the police officer and said the words that changed everything. Arrest him. Uncle Chitty's body stiffened. What? The police officer hesitated. Madam, are you sure? Arrest him. There was a weight to her voice. Finality. Uncle Chitty took a step back. For the first time, he looked afraid. But before he could move, the officer grabbed him. A stunned gasp escaped Nkem's lips as Uncle Chitty was yanked backward. His arms twisted behind him. His struggles were useless. This is madness, he shouted. You have no proof. The officer didn't reply. He was already pulling out his handcuffs. And Nkem? She stood there, watching. For the first time in over a year, she was no longer afraid. Her uncle's reign of terror was over. But what she didn't know was, this was only the beginning. The night air was thick with tension. Uncle Chitty thrashed against the officer's grip, his voice rising in desperation. You can't do this. I am a respected man in this community. Who will believe the word of a small girl over mine? But the officer didn't flinch. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. For the first time in his life, Uncle Chitty was powerless. Nkem stood frozen, watching as the man who had stolen her innocence, who had made her life a living nightmare, was dragged away like the criminal he was. And yet, her chest felt tight. Would this really be the end? Would she ever feel safe again? Auntie Kemi's warm hands suddenly grabbed her shoulders, turning her around. Nkem, she whispered, her voice shaking. Are you all right? All right? How could she be all right? Nkem's body was bruised, her soul felt shattered, and her heart still didn't believe this was real. She wanted to collapse, to cry, to scream, but all she did was stare at her aunt, her lips trembling. He's gone. Auntie Kemi nodded. Yes, my child. He's gone. Gone. The words should have brought her relief, but instead her hands curled into fists. No, she whispered. He's not gone. Auntie Kemi blinked. What? Kem swallowed hard. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to stand tall. Auntie. He's not the only one. Auntie Kemi stiffened. What do you mean? Nkem's lips parted, but before she could speak, the police officer returned. His face was grim. We have a problem. Auntie Kemi turned sharply. What problem? The officer exhaled. When we put him in the car, he started laughing. He said. The officer hesitated before continuing. I may be gone, but I am not alone. Tell her she'll never be free. The air turned ice cold. Nkem felt like her heart had stopped. Auntie Kemi's grip on her arm tightened. What is he talking about? Nkem's breath hitched. She had been so desperate to escape. She had forgotten the most terrifying part. She looked up at her aunt, fear clouding her eyes. Auntie, she whispered. He's not lying. Auntie Kemi's entire body went rigid. Nkem, talk to me. Nkem slowly shook her head, her hands trembling. There were others. Silence. The officer and Auntie Kemi exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. But Nkem wasn't finished. She swallowed the lump in her throat and finally said the words she had been too scared to say for years. He was not working alone. A thick, suffocating silence filled the air. Auntie Kemi's grip on Kem's arm tightened. Her eyes, once filled with relief, were now wide with shock. What do you mean, he wasn't working alone? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Kem's stomach twisted. Should she say it? She had spent years swallowing her words, choking on her own screams. But no more. She forced herself to speak. There were others, Auntie, she said, her voice trembling. Other men. Sometimes. He would invite them. Auntie Kemi's body went stiff. Her face darkened with horror. The police officer sucked in a sharp breath. You're saying there were multiple people involved? Kem slowly nodded. Her nightmares had never just been about Uncle Chitty. She had recognized some of the voices, the faces. Men from the community. Men who smiled at her in public. Men who acted as if they were respectable. And now they knew she had spoken. The thought made her skin crawl. What if they come for me? Her voice cracked. Auntie Kemi didn't hesitate. Nkem, you are coming with me. Nkem's eyes widened. What? Her aunt turned to the officer, her expression sharp as a blade. She can't go back to that house. I won't let her. The officer nodded, but his face remained troubled. Madam, if what she's saying is true, this is bigger than just Chitty. We need names. Names. Kem felt like she was sinking into quicksand. Giving those names meant she could end this nightmare forever. But it also meant they would come for her. What if the police couldn't protect her? What if they silenced her before she could speak again? She could already hear their voices in her head. You dare open your mouth? Nobody will believe you. You will regret this. Her hands began to shake. Auntie Kemi must have noticed because she cupped Nkem's face gently, forcing her to look into her eyes. You are not alone anymore, she whispered. You hear me? Kem swallowed hard. Her entire life she had fought this battle alone. But maybe not anymore. She took a deep breath, forcing the words out before fear could stop her. I know who they are. The officer leaned in. Who? Nkem? Tell me their names. She hesitated, then a loud bang erupted from outside. Auntie Kemi grabbed Nkem and pulled her behind her. What was that? The officer reached for his gun. Stay here. He moved toward the door, but before he could reach it, the power suddenly cut off. The entire compound was swallowed by darkness. And in that moment Nkem knew. They were here.